Chapter 3. One evening Olaf had been sitting half asleep in his corner of the church. When he heard the scraping of feet in the choir, he stood up and went forward into the nave. Right opposite, on the women's side, was a statue raised against one of the pillars, of the Virgin with the child in her arms and the crescent moon under her feet. This evening a thick wax candle was burning before the image. Just beneath it knelt a young woman. The moment Olaf looked at her, she turned her face his way. And now his breath went from him, and he lost all sense of himself and where he was. But this was Ingunn. She was kneeling there, not 5 paces from him. Then he recalled the time and place, and that she was dead, and he didn't know what to believe. He felt as if the heart within him stood still and quivered. He didn't know whether it was fear or joy that made him powerless, whether he was looking on one dead. The narrow face with the straight nose and long weak chin, the shadow of the eyelashes on the clear cheeks. The hollows of the temples were darkened by a wave of golden brown hair. A transparent veil fell from the crown of the head in long folds over the weak and sloping shoulders. Even as he drank in the first vision of her charm, Olaf saw that perhaps this was not she, but that 2 persons could be so like one another. So slender and delicate from the waist down to the knees, such long thin hands. She held a book before her, and her lips moved slightly. Now she turned the leaf. She knelt upon a cushion of red silk. A sobering sense crept over him that it was not she after all, as when one wakes from a heavy sleep and recognizes one thing after another in the room where one is, realizing that the rest was a dream. So now he realized little by little. His poor darling, she had not been able to read a book. She had never had such clothes. As he looked upon the rich dress of the strange woman, a bitter compassion with Ingunn stirred within him. There was never any one to give her such apparel. He remembered her as she had been all the years at Hestviken, in bad health and robbed of her youth and charm, poor and unkempt in the coarse rustic folds of her homespun kirtle. She should have been like this one, kneeling upon her silken cushion, rosy-cheeked, fresh and slim. Her mantle spread far over the stone slabs, and it was of some rich, dark material. Her kirtle was cut so low that her bosom and arms showed through the thin golden-yellow silk of her shift. Half hidden in the folds at her throat gleamed a great rosary. Some of its beads were of the colour of red wine, and sparkled as her bosom rose and fell. She was quite young. She looked as Ingunn had looked as she knelt in the church at Hamar, childlike and fair under her woman's coif. The strange woman must have felt his continual stare. Now she looked up at him. And again Olaf felt his heart give a start. She had the same great dark eyes too, and the uncertain, hesitating sidelong glance, just as Ingunn used to look up at those she met for the first time. She had never looked at him in this way, and a vague and obscure feeling stirred in the man's mind that he had been cheated of something, because Ingunn had never looked upon him for the first time. The young wife looked down at her book again. Her cheeks had flushed, her eyelids quivered uneasily. Olaf guessed that he annoyed her with his staring, so he tried to desist. But he could think of nothing but her presence. Every moment he had to glance across at her. Once he met a stolen look from her, shy and inquisitive. Quickly she dropped her eyes again. The procession came down from the choir, and the sprinkling of holy water recalled him wholly to his senses. But truly it was a strange thing that here in London he should chance to see a woman who was so like his dead wife, and young enough to be her daughter. He remembered that he had not yet said his evening prayers, knelt down and said them, but without thinking of what he was whispering. Then he saw that she was coming this way. She swept past so close to him that her cloak brushed against his. When he rose to his feet, she was standing beside him, with her back turned. She had laid her hand on the shoulder of a man who was still kneeling. Behind her stood an old serving woman in a hooded cloak, carrying her mistress's cushion under her arm. The man stood up. Olaf guessed he must be the strange woman's husband. Olaf knew him well by sight, for he came to this church nearly every day. He was blind. He was young and always very richly clad, and he would not have been ugly but for the great scar over his eyebrows and his dead eyes. The left one seemed quite gone. The eyelid clung to the empty socket, but the right eye bulged out, showing a strip under the lid, and this was grey and darkly veined, as pebbles sometimes are. His face was pale and swollen like that of a prisoner. He looked as if he sat too long indoors. His small and shapely mouth was drawn down at the corners, tired and slack. His black curly hair fell forward over his forehead in moist strands. He was of middle height and well knit, but somewhat inclined to fatness. Olaf stood outside the church door and watched them. The blind man kept his hand on his wife's shoulder as he walked, and after them came the serving woman and a page. They went northward along the street. That night Olaf could not fall asleep. As he lay he felt the slight rocking of the vessel in the stream, and heard the sound of the water underneath her, and through his mind the memories came floating of Ingunn when they were young. Sometimes they gathered speed, came faster, wove themselves into visions. He thought he had opened his arms to receive her, and started up, wide awake, felt that he was bathed in sweat, with a strange faintness in all his limbs. It was too hot in his barrel. He crawled out and went forward on deck. It was dripping wet with dew. The sky was clear tonight above the everlasting light mists that floated over the river and the marshy banks. A few great stars shone moistly through the haze. The water gurgled as it ran among the piles of the wharf. A man was rowing somewhere out in the darkness. Olaf seated himself on the chest of arms in the bow. Bending forward over the gunwale, he gazed out into the night. The outline of the woods in the south showed black against the dark sky. A dog barked far away. Dreams and memories continued to course through him. It was their youth that rose from the dead and appeared to him. All the years since then, his outlawry, the time of disaster which came and shattered all his prospects, all the after years when he had tried to bear his own burden, and hers too, as well as he could. They seemed to drift past him, out of sight, as he headed back against the stream. At last he started up. He had fallen asleep upon the chest, and now he was chilled through. Now he would surely be able to sleep if he crept in again and lay down. Outside the day was already dawning. He grunted when Thomas Tabor came and waked him. Today Thomas could take Leif with him to Mass. Then he would stay aboard. In the course of the afternoon Olaf made ready to row ashore. It was warm now in the daytime. He could not bear his hackathon under his kirtle. The one he had brought with him was so heavy, of thick canvas padded with wool. There could be no great danger in going undefended. As yet he had had no quarrel thrust upon him in the town, and the hackathon made him so bulky and awkward. Olav girded himself with a short broadsword before putting on his kirtle, It was split over the left hip so that one could easily get at a concealed weapon. It was a rich kirtle, reaching to the feet, of black French cloth with green embroidery, light enough for warm weather. Ingunn had made it for him many years ago. At that time he had much more need of suitable working clothes. Not often had he had use for this handsome garment, but it was finely sewed and finished. He chose a brown hoodless cloak bordered with marten's fur and a black narrow-brimmed felt hat with silver chains about the crown. He pressed it down so that his greying, silvery golden hair waved out under the brim on every side. Though he would not admit it to himself, when he took the pains he still looked a fair and manly man, and few would have guessed that he was as old as 37 winters. He rode straight into the town and strolled through the streets and alleys. But as soon as the bells began to ring for vespers, he made straight for the church of the Dominicans. Just after him came the blind man and his wife and their 2 servants. Olav had now forbidden Leif to leave the ship after the middle of the afternoon. Instead, he sent him ashore with Thomas Tabor every other morning. In this way he himself could only attend Mass every other day, but it would be too bad if the young man met with a mischance out there in Southwark, and it would bring trouble on them all if one of their ship's company came to any harm ashore. The blind man came to Mass at the convent church every morning, and on most days to Compline as well. She was always there at vespers, and sometimes with her husband at evensong. Olav did not know who these folks might be, or where they lived, nor did he ever think to find it out. It was only that a change had come about in his mind. All the thoughts that had been habitual with him for years, all the daily doings and cares, and all that belonged to his life as a grown man, had been flooded by a fountain that had sprung up in him. It was beyond his own control. In all these years, when he had thought of his youthful memories, he had not recalled them in this way. Now they were not things of the past. He walked in the midst of them. It was as though everything was to happen now for the first time. Or it was as when one lies between sleep and waking, knowing that one's dreams are dreams, but seeking to hold them fast, struggling not to be wholly awake. And every day he came hither to see this blind man's wife, for at the sight of her these clear dreamlike memories flowed more freely and abundantly. The image of the rich young wife became one with the sweet frail shadow of the young Ingunn. And she was no longer angry with him for looking at her. She vouchsafed him this, he had noticed. One evening he entered the church, walking fast, and bent the knee as he passed the high altar. The scabbard of the sword he wore under his kirtle struck the pavement hard, driving the hilt against his chin. He must have cut a ridiculous figure, and when he looked round at her, he saw that she was bursting with suppressed laughter. Olav turned red as fire with anger. But after a while, when he looked around again, he met her eyes, and then she smiled at him. And then he had to smile too, though he was both vexed and angry. After that he kept an eye on her. She followed her book diligently, but all the time little secret smiles played like gleams across her lovely face. After the service he stood outside the church as she came out, leading her husband. She saw him, bowed slightly. Olav did not know whether it should betoken a greeting or not, but before he had time to reflect, he had bowed in return, with his hand on his breast. Afterwards he was vexed with himself. If only he had known whether she had meant to greet him or not. The next day he took his station outside the church door at the time folk began to come to vespers. She came with her usual company. Olav bowed, but she made as though she did not see him and went in. Then he was angry and ashamed, and would not look over to where she was. He tried to join in the singing and not think of other things, but presently he felt that she was looking at him, and as he met the glance of her great dark eyes, she smiled, a bright and gentle smile that was like sunshine. And after that they exchanged glances and smiles as though they had been old acquaintances, although they had never said a word to one another, and Olaf did not know so much as her name. Olaf never thought that his shipmates must have remarked the change that had come over him. He was not himself aware that he had put a distance between him and the two seamen. Until now they had lived together as companions and equals. That Olaf was the Master of Hestviken, and Thomas a minstrel in Oslo in winter time, while Leif was the son of a widow who served in the house of the armourer, this difference was so familiar and obvious that it concerned them no more than that Olaf was fair and middle-aged, while Thomas was old and grey, and Leif a boy, red-haired and freckled. But now Olaf moved among them without being aware that he scarce noticed them. As the young son of a lord instinctively and without premeditation puts off his childhood familiarity with the serving men of the manor, from the day he first divines the path that lies before him, and feels that he is destined for another lot than theirs. Each time Olaf was going into the town, he put on his long kirtle. He shaved himself regularly, and one evening he went to a barber. But the others made as though they did not see such things, and Olaf never thought whether they saw it or not. He was not himself aware that he had become, as it were, another man, and was acting more as became a lad of 20 than a landowner of well-nigh 20 years. Thorod and Galfred had returned to London, and it could not be very long before they were ready for the homeward voyage. Olaf thought of it with a twinge of reluctance. He did not feel that he was ready to leave England, and vague thoughts of letting them go home without him stirred within him. The idea he favoured most was that of entering an order, the machinations for choice, and setting out for the lands of the Paynims. But he was not yet ready for that. Just at this time it was as though he had grown deaf and dumb to the voice that had spoken so powerfully to him, but that should not be for long. Only there was something else that he must think out first. He was not very clear about it. But he had already known, as it were, a foretaste of the peace which results when a man has surrendered himself to God, so he knew that he would make that surrender in the end. 2 young Englishmen had booked a passage in the Reindeer. They wished to make a pilgrimage to St. Olaf in Nidaros. They were good seamen, both of them, so the Richardsons had no need of him as a shipman. And now the summer was already far spent. 3 weeks had gone by since he saw the strange woman for the first time. One evening she did not come to evensong. As Olaf left the church after the service, someone caught him by the mantle. He turned around. It was her servant, the old woman in the hooded cloak. She said something. He did not understand a word, and yet he knew. He nodded silently and followed the old nurse. Olaf had never been outside Ludgate before. He remembered as he crossed the drawbridge that in an hour the curfew bell would ring, and then they closed the gates, and he wore no armour under his kirtle, and no other weapon than the little sword he had hidden in its folds. But even these thoughts were not able to raise their heads above the frenzy that flooded his soul. Here under the western wall ran a little stream which came in from the country and flowed into the Thames, foul and stinking with the refuse that was thrown into it over the city wall. There were but few buildings before this gate, and the ground was marshy along the banks of the brook. But a few steps, and they were on a path that led through the swamp. There were little ponds shining white, and beds of rushes and brushwood on both sides. The low land further out was dotted with farms and groves and church towers, and the sky, arching wide overhead, was covered with fleecy clouds, streaked with yellow from the setting sun behind. The path brought them back to the little stream. The woman said something and pointed to a cluster of houses beyond the meadows. Olaf saw the gables of a stone-built mansion among the trees and the roofs of outhouses. But they did not approach the place on the side where the stone hall stood. They followed a paling over which hung green thorn bushes, and Olaf could smell that the cattle yard was inside. Then along the bulging wall of a long mud house with a thatched roof. There was a gate in the wall, and the woman unlocked a little wicket in one side of it. A strong, rank smell of pigs met his nostrils, and the passage between the outhouses into which they came was so miry that he walked almost ankle-deep in greasy black slush. They went across a little field in which linen was laid out to bleach, and the woman let Olaf into a garden through a gate in a wattled fence. The grass was already bedewed under the apple trees, and in the cool air floated the scent of fruit trees and dill and celery, and of flowers whose names he did not know, but all seemed bathed and cooled by the evening air. Here in the garden the daylight had already begun to fade. The woman led Olaf to a corner of the herbery, where bushes grew in a ring. She said something. He guessed that he was to wait here while she left him and was lost among the apple trees. Close by grew a cluster of tall white lilies which shone in the gathering dusk and breathed out their heavy, oversweet scent. Then he saw that the lilies stood at the entrance to an arbour which was half hidden among the bushes. Olaf went a few steps toward it and looked in. Just inside the entrance hung a wicker bird cage. There was a bird in it, and it hopped silently up and down between two perches. Within the arbour he saw that there was a bed prepared. His heart hammered and hammered in his breast. He stood motionless. A moth fluttered against his face, making him start. There she came across the grass among the fruit trees. She walked with bent head, holding up her light gown before her with one hand. Her cloak was thrown back over her slender shoulders, and Olaf saw that she wore nothing but the thin yellow undergarment. With a gasp and a thrill of happiness, he knew that in a moment he would clasp her tender, pliant body under the thin silk. She bore a silver goblet in the other hand. Now she stood straight before him, bending her head yet deeper. Then she raised the cup and drank to him. Olaf accepted it and drank. There was wine in it, so sweet as to be mawkish. He handed back the cup. The young woman paused for a moment with it in her hand. Then she let it fall onto the grass. And now she raised her face and looked into his. The great eyes, the wide nostrils and the half-open mouth were like chasms of darkness in the pale oval. Olaf took a step forward and threw his arms about the slender, silk-clad wife. She sank into his embrace, with her ice-cold fingers clasped about his neck. Olaf bent the crown of her head to his lips. First of all he would drink in the scent of her, and found with a shock of aversion that she smelled of unguent, a luscious, oily scent. Nevertheless he kissed her on the hair, but the mawkish smell of her ointment filled his senses with repugnance, as though he had been deceived. He had thirsted for a breath of young hair and skin. Unconsciously he turned his head away. He knew well enough that rich ladies used such perfumes to anoint themselves with, but he disliked it. Although he felt how she clung to him in abandonment, he, who for years had not held a woman in his embrace, stood there with his arms full of her. And yet his senses were cooled by the thought that this was an unknown. No, this was not she. And it was as though he heard a cry coming from somewhere outside. A voice which he heard not with his bodily ears called to him, aloud and wild with fear, trying to warn him. From somewhere, from the ground under his feet, he thought, the cry came. Ingunn, he knew, the real Ingunn, was striving to come to his aid. He could tell that she was in the utmost distress. In bonds of powerlessness or sin, she was fighting to be heard by him through the darkness that parted them. The woman hung upon him with her arms clasped about his neck and her head buried in his shoulder. Olav was still holding her as he gazed, listening over her head, feeling his own desire, not quenched, but as it were dissolved in foam, far away from this one. Ingunn called to him. She was afraid he would not understand that this stranger was one who had borrowed her shape, seeking to drag him under. "No, no, Ingunn, I hear you. I am coming." He strained all his senses to catch clearly this ringing cry of distress, which did not reach his bodily ears, even as he did not see with his bodily eyes the form that struggled beneath folds of gloom. Now it grew fainter. Olav gently loosened the strange woman's hands from his neck and drew back from her a little. She followed, and now she looked up. His head swam as he met her timid, gentle animal look. She was so like Ingunn that he was sick with desire to kiss the living lips, although he knew it was a stranger that looked at him, beseechingly and cravingly from the depths of those eyes that were so terribly like Ingunn's. But he felt as if he must use his utmost force to tear himself away from her. It was like the temptation of his worst nights, when he could not help thinking of the fjord, of plunging into its waters and being free of it all. "No, Ingunn, I hear you. Help, Mary." As he gave way, she threw herself into his arms, as a wave strikes a ship's bows, and unconsciously he raised himself on his toes as he shook himself free of her. The touch of her long white hands was the last he felt. He turned and walked quickly away. Behind him he heard a low, long-drawn whine, and then cries, howls of scorn and rage. He swung himself over the fence. His kirtle caught in it a moment. "Now they will come after me," thought Olav. "She will call the servants now." He ran across the bleaching field and between some cattle sheds, and reached the palisade. It was twice the height of a man at least. How he got over he did not know, as he stood outside in a little dry field among haystacks. He had a feeling that he had pushed something against the fence, and instantly he seemed to recall having done the same once before, made his escape over a fence. That was all. He had said it aloud, standing ready to run as he listened whether any sound came from within the enclosure. He was on a different side of the mansion from that to which the woman had brought him. Olav heard nothing. Then he ran straight across the fields, taking the nearest way to cover. Passing through the grove, he found a track that led by some mud cabins and down to the marshes about a little river. He did not know exactly where it was. It was down in a valley, but he followed the path along the river, thinking meanwhile that now the gates would be shut. Darkness was falling fast. He could not enter the town, and he could scarcely reach the reindeer tonight. Well, there was no help for it. He passed his hand over his forehead and noticed that he had lost his hat. Well, so be it. Here was a plank bridge, and when he came up the slope on the other side, he could see the light town walls and the high, pale watchtowers in the dusk. He continued to follow the ill-marked path across the fields to the northward. Down toward the Thames, the land seemed to be all swamp. How far and for how long he had walked, he did not know, but he thought he must be somewhere to the north of the town. Pools of water shone here and there in the darkness, and from some place came the baying and howling of great, deep-voiced hounds. Olaf knew that the townsman's hunt had its kennels somewhere out in the country, but it had an ugly sound in the dark. To the left of the path he made out a piece of rising ground on which tall trees grew. There was a faint glimmer of dead leaves underneath them. Olaf's senses grasped, without his being aware of it, that the ground here would be as good and dry as he could expect to find. He went up the slope. The brambles caught and tore his clothes. Then he came upon something like a suitable hollow and lay down, wrapping his cloak about him as well as he could. Now he felt that he was bathed in sweat, soaked and bemired almost to the waist, both kirtle and hose. Olaf drew his sword and lay on his side, holding it under him. He fell asleep at once. He woke in pitch darkness, choking with horror, and thought he had cried out. Struggling with the tangle of his dream, he didn't know where he was. He lay on the bare ground, and around him was a blackness that stirred and flickered, and he was wet and icy cold, and his heart was ready to break with despair and remorse and guilty feeling. He was lying in withered leaves. Then memories dawned on him, of his adventure and of his dream interwoven. At the same time as he recalled how he had come to be lying out in the woods, he remembered his dream too, and slowly the horror ebbed away. Even now it seemed gruesome to recall it, but it was only a dream, and he had not done it. No, not even in his dream could he remember that he had done anything to the young child. That three-edged dagger of his he had not even brought with him on the voyage. It lay at home in his chest. He had thought he stood by a bed, in the dark and in a forest, as it seemed. A bed that was full of withered, wet and earthy leaves, and half buried in the leaves lay a naked human body. The leaves covered it to the waist, and covered the upper part of the face. He was not sure whether it was a boy or a girl, but he thought it was a little girl. The smooth, childish breast was so white and looked so soft. And under the left pap there was a triangular wound, as if someone had thrust in one of those daggers with a three-cornered blade up to the hilt. A little blood had oozed from the lowest lip of the wound, but it was one of those ugly silent wounds which hardly bleed at all. The blood runs inward, suffocating the heart. And the mortal horror of it had been that he had thought this was his work, and he was not able to bear it. He tried to take the dead child up in his arms. He must bring her back to life. Yet he could not remember having dreamt that he thrust the dagger into the child, and it was but a dream. A wind was blowing, with a sighing in the tree-tops and a rustling of leaves. He lay shivering and tried to distinguish things about him in the dark. A little animal was stirring among the dry leaves. His dream still troubled him, and he could not guess what it might mean. He had never wronged any woman, that he knew of, save Torhild, but this was a little girl. He remembered plainly the face of the dead child among the leaves. The chin was short and broad, the lips full, the hair dark and reaching no further than the shoulders. He could not recall having known any child like her. It could not be Cecilia, his fair-haired child. A warm feeling of relief went through him. There could be no danger threatening her. But his thoughts would not leave the dream. Either it was a sorcery of the evil powers, or a warning which he was unable to interpret as yet. And he thought of that adventure in the garden the evening before, Was that real or glamour? She had been so like Ingunn that it could not be true, and he had felt that Ingunn herself was there, quite near him, wailing in the fires of sorrow and impotence. And all at once he saw it. If she had not been able to make him hear, if she had been forced to witness it, in the place where she was, bound with fetters of gloom and death and powerlessness, that he yielded himself to the pixie, or whatever she was. It was as though something went to pieces within him. Sorrow and tenderness flowed over, hot as blood, and filled his being, thawed and relaxed every fibre. So near had he been to working her destruction, after he had striven all the years she had lived to sustain her as well as he could. Then it flashed on him that he had called on Mary for help, and he wondered at it. For it was years since he had asked anything of her. It had seemed that he must think himself above seeking help there, when he wilfully defied her son. He had said his Ave, as he had been wont to do from childhood, in order to show her such honour as was her due, but never with the thought of gaining anything. And now he had called upon her, as a lost child calls for its mother. Olaf turned over on his other side, and settled himself with his face buried in his arm, so as to shut out the darkness. Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae. He would repeat the anthem over and over again until he fell asleep, and had no other thought in his mind. Ah, yes, Mary, now I will come and pray for grace with our Lord. By turns he slept a while, woke again, slept, and tossed in a riot of disconnected dream visions, and over them all was a vague horror. Each time he awoke with a stab of pain at the heart. But each time he settled himself again, summoning all his will to the same end, the prayer which was to be his shield that night. And then at last he woke and felt that the sun was shining and that he was rested. And there still lingered in his mind the aftertaste of a morning dream, giving sweetness and security beyond compare. He was penetrated all through by the raw cold of the ground, but he lay still, gazing about him in the woodland, where the dew glistened white and blue in the brightness of the morning. The drops lay thick on every blade of grass. The bushes with the dark, hard, spiked leaves shone like burnished steel. A blue haze lay among the trees, round which the ivy twined its green curtain. And the dream ran on in his mind like the soft and milky morning light. He had thought he lay in a woman's lap, with his head against her heart, and from his feeling of deep sweetness, free from desire, he knew who she was, and said it. Mother. He did not recall the look of her face, did not recall it now, but in his dream he thought he had recognized her, although he had been but a tiny witless infant when she died. Arnvid had also been dimly present once in his dream, in a long white garment, the habit of his order, no doubt, and Arnvid had spoken to his mother. But they had talked, as it were, over his head, as though he had been a child in swaddling clothes that his mother held in her lap. Bishop Thorfinn he had also seen. Their figures were all illumined as clouds are by the sun behind them, but this refulgence did not shine upon him, and he knew that it was not the sun, but a knowledge or a vision that was theirs, but he did not have it. He only saw the reflection of it in them. A little church bell began to tinkle not far away. Olaf got to his feet, stiff with cold. He was in a sorry state, with kirtle rent and soiled. He brushed and picked off leaves and litter. If he had only had a cloak with a hood to it. He took it off and carried it over his arm. Thus his going hatless would be less noticed. Olaf followed the sound of the bell. The path led down along the edge of the beechwood. On rounding the corner, he looked involuntarily to the westward, but instantly thought it would be of little use to look for that manor house. It would scarce be there today. The little church where the bell was ringing stood on a mound on the other side of a brook. He made for it, sure that there he would find the solution of all that baffled him. It was a bare and poor little house, and the air was musty and raw within. Olav guessed that Mass was not often said here, and the Mass that was now being celebrated was for the benefit of the 10 or 12 poorly clad men who stood near the altar with a banner in their midst. It was no doubt some little brotherhood, and this was their feast day. The men had made themselves trim according to their means, but the priest's chasuble was threadbare. The deacon and the choir boys seemed listless and comported themselves without grace or dignity, while the priest hurried through the service as though his only thought was to get it over. Any message to himself he could not find, other than that he stood there, poor and a stranger, among these poor men who took part with him in the perfunctory office. It became clearer to him than before how little a middle-aged man counts for in this world, when he is stripped of all the added worth that goods and kindred bring. And he would learn this more and more thoroughly the farther he strayed from his home. He saw that now. He had learnt it once before, he remembered, in his youth, in the years when he was an outlaw. A clear, cool bitterness seized upon him. Was it for this he had come home? And was it for this he had dwelt all those years with his only dear one as in a dark house, that God should now lead him out, lock the door behind him, and send him roaming again? He saw his manor as in a vision, more clearly than he had ever seen it with his eyes. The wharf and the sheds with the water of the fjord lapping about the piles, the long row of sun-scorched turf roofs and dun gables up on the hillside, and the wall of the horse crag behind, his cornfields among bare grey and reddish rocks, the hills around grey and weather-worn, with wind-bent firs toward the fjord, meadows inland along the valley, and then the forest. The domain was not so great, and he had seen greater, but it was his. From here his fathers before him had gone out into the world, and hither they had returned. If all else in his life had turned out otherwise than he had expected, he had won back his patrimony and maintained it. He would leave behind no less than he had received. There were boats now, great and small, by the wharves. There were fields and meadows that he had cleared anew on the mossy, alder-grown land toward Kverndahl. The poor men advanced to the altar in a body. Now he saw the image on their banner, Jesus bending under the cross and a man walking behind and helping to bear it, Simon the Cyrenian. So it was a guild of porters. A deacon made a sign to Olav, thinking he belonged to the fellowship. Olav shook his head and knelt down where he had been standing, down by the door. And in the poor venture of the host, our Lord descended and gave himself to his poor friends. He was the only one present who dared not go forward to the table. For years he had known that when he needs must go, at Easter, he went as Judas went to the Last Supper. As a child he had never been able to understand that Judas dared, for he must have known that God knew what he had done. Now he himself was in the same case as Judas Iscariot. He moved among his fellow Christians, and they reckoned him a good Christian, even as the apostles had reckoned Judas their fellow, as they sat down with him at table that evening. And his only thought had been that in the midst of the company he was alone with him who knew of his betrayal. Such a man had he become. Yet his spirit had once been as a young field, full of the good corn that had been sown in it, the heritage of his ancestors, loyal men and unafraid, who did not cast their eyes backward over their lost happiness so long as they could keep their honour bright. But he had so ordered his life that now it had become as the lost fields he had found when he came home to Hestviken, overgrown with weeds and scrub. Olav looked up. Upon the wall opposite there was painted a picture of our Lord sitting at the marriage feast at Cana, and near to him stood Mary. She motioned with her hand to the servants, while her eyes looked straight into those of the man kneeling by the door. "Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it." Olav did not know whether he had heard the words from outside or within himself. "Then clear me, Lord, as the husbandman clears his field with fire and with sickle. Take back thine inheritance, that it may bear increase for thee." Once again he saw Hestviken as in a magic vision. A vision of a grey sea flecked with silver over the glittering waves, and beyond it the coast sinking in a blue-grey mist. And he saw himself, so puny and alone, as a man standing on a rock in the outermost belt of skerries. In solitude he waited for him who walks upon the glittering waves, as a husbandman walks over his fields and checks the storm, as a man checks his horse. And the man on the skerry was free, so free as none can conceive, save he who has been stifled in the darkness through the long night of deadly sin. Among the torch-bearing acolytes, the priest advanced along the line of poor workmen. Each time he took a host from the ciborium, Olav prayed softly, "Thou rich Christ, have mercy upon me. Thou rich Christ." Never till now had he reflected why men called God in that way. Now he knew it. "Lord, I am not worthy that thou shouldst enter in under my roof. I am poor and naked. I own nothing wherewith to do thee honour. But thou enterest into an empty house, Lord, and fillest thy creature with blessings. Then it may be that thou wilt take me into thy service again. Am I too old to learn to read and sing thy praises? Then I am surely young and strong enough to be sold in exchange for an outworn slave in the land of the blacks." He became aware of someone tapping on the wall close beside him. A half-grown boy was chipping off plaster with the key and seemed impatient to lock up. The church was empty. Olav rose to his feet and went out. Down through the fields they passed, the brotherhood, the priest and his assistants. The blue silken banner showed up against the yellowing wheat. The boy locked the church door and darted after them. Olav followed slowly, bareheaded in the sunshine. The ship's boat was gone when he reached the landing place at the west of the town. He had to go on to the Hythe where they lay and find a ferryman. He laughed on seeing Olav and said something. Olav guessed the meaning, if not the words, joined in the laugh and shook his head. He was strangely cheerful and light-hearted, as though in the face of a new departure. On board he found the Richardsons. Olav saw they had been talking about him, and they looked at him with sly merriment, coming home so late in the day, ragged and without his hat. But they ignored it, and so did Olav. The Richardsons had come to get the others to join them in a pilgrimage. There was a sanctuary somewhere in the woods north of London with a miraculous image of Our Lady. This had once been hidden in a hollow oak when the Vikings were harrying the land, and found again in that place. Tomorrow was the feast day. Olav was glad. He had already thought that from tomorrow he would attend a Church of Mary. He cared no more to think of the Dominicans' church.